In the quiet town of Pontypool, Ontario, radio host Grant Massey drives through a heavy blizzard on his way to work, all while arguing with a colleague over the phone. Annoyed, he tosses the phone aside, but the persistent caller forces him to pull over. Just then, a strange woman appears at his window, yelling incomprehensibly. Grant glances away, and when he looks back, she has vanished. Though puzzled, he shakes it off and continues to the radio station. Upon arrival, Grant is met by his co-host Laurel Ann, who's already at the console prepping the morning's segments and combing through news. She urges him to drop his trademark silly jokes. Grant begins his show, greeting the town and commenting on the stormy weather. Producer Sydney Breyer steps in to monitor his talkative habits. Grant then plays a track for listeners and takes a call from field reporter Ken Loney, who claims to be reporting on the snowstorm from a helicopter. The next segment features a constable discussing an operation targeting illegal cannabis crops. Grant sensationalizes the story, prompting Sydney to cut him off and reprimand him for embellishing the facts. This sparks a tense exchange between them, with Grant frustrated by the constraints on his freedom to speak. They eventually compromise, and he switches to lighter news: a missing cat. The memory of the strange woman resurfaces, and Grant wonders aloud if he should have reported her. Oddly, there's no listener feedback, despite their usual eagerness to respond. Laurel Ann picks up a police code, hinting at a hostage situation, and taps into the police channel. Though no confirmation follows, Sydney urges her not to inform Grant yet, as he's distracted by a caller discussing emergency calls. Grant then spins a story about hostage takers in a truck, which Sydney tries to shut down. But he doubles down with jokes about drunken fishermen and police at the end of fishing season. Exasperated, Sydney listens as Grant mocks her serious demeanor. Eventually, she reveals that Ken isn't in a helicopter at all. He's just parked on a hill pretending for effect. Despite that, the public loves the illusion. Sydney then admits she spoke to the constable, who sounded genuinely scared. Suddenly, a call from Ken brings troubling news. A crowd is gathering outside Dr. Mendez's office, accusing the doctor of negligence and demanding accountability. Grant connects Ken to the broadcast, and the reporter describes a chaotic scene filled with death and destruction. He hears explosions but sees no police presence, only military helicopters flying overhead. Ken has no idea what's really happening, but it's clearly serious. Back at the station, Sydney and Laurel Ann try to verify the information, but they're unable to reach any authorities. To complicate things further, a scheduled group of Arabic guests arrives for an interview. Grant is frustrated, but Sydney reminds him to stay focused since nothing has been confirmed yet. As one guest begins singing, another suddenly claims that God is gone and the world is ending. She struggles with her words, then begins speaking in strange, meaningless sounds, unsettling Grant. Grant becomes increasingly convinced that something horrific is unfolding, though there are still no official updates. Then a man named Steve calls in, but his message quickly turns into panicked screams, urging everyone to flee before the line cuts off. Despite Sydney's attempts to silence him, thinking it might be a hoax, Grant continues discussing it. Callers who follow speak rapidly and incoherently, only adding to the confusion. Finally, they reach the constable, who confirms that the crowd stormed Dr. Mendez's office, where an elderly woman later died. Sydney remains doubtful, but the constable adds that the woman kept mumbling about Hitler before her death. Grant notes that the mob seems to be moving through the area, while speaking in some unknown language. A new call comes in reporting a family trapped in their car, yet Sydney maintains this could be part of a grim psychological experiment. Suddenly, a BBC journalist calls, asking Grant to confirm rumors that Canadian military forces are sealing off the country. Grant denies knowing anything, but the BBC reporter insists the information is accurate. At last, Ken gets back on the line, confirming something horrific is unfolding. He says he's in hiding after witnessing people being killed and possibly eaten, as the population descends into madness. Ken describes seeing victims dragged from their cars and bitten. Then he notices someone who's entered his basement and collapsed. The man speaks, and Ken, despite Grant's urgent pleas not to, moves closer to hear him. Just then, the call is overtaken by a French broadcast. Laurel Ann translates it but finds the message bizarre, as it seems to revolve around infant gibberish. Grant makes an emergency plea to listeners, telling them to stay inside and avoid speaking English. He even warns against translating his message. Pontypool is placed under quarantine. Ken calls in again, playing disturbing audio of his wounded neighbor, who sounds like a babbling child, then suddenly falls silent. Sydney is left stunned when the BBC reporter casually mentions the missing cat. Grant becomes increasingly unsettled and decides to leave the studio, repeating something about the missing cat he'd seen on posters around town. Despite Sydney's efforts to calm him down, he heads for the door. Laurel Ann spots a crowd approaching, and the three quickly barricade themselves inside. Grant jumps on air and begins recounting terrifying stories of murders now spreading nationwide. Sydney and Laurel Ann try to ignore the broadcast, but Grant's erratic behavior becomes harder to ignore. Soon, even Laurel Ann starts acting oddly. She insists Grant isn't actually in the studio and abruptly walks away, leaving Sydney confused. While Sydney is trying to regain composure by making herself tea, Dr. Mendez climbs through the window and immediately notices Laurel Ann frozen in place. He ushers Sydney into Grant's soundproof booth and warns her that Laurel Ann is already infected, though she isn't aware of it yet. The doctor takes over the broadcast just as Laurel Ann begins slamming her head against the glass and gnawing at her own lip. Mendez explains that before people die, they desperately seek others to share their fate with. Meanwhile, Ken calls in again and says his neighbor has died. He hears people mumbling about boats as they pass by. Suddenly, Ken stumbles mid-sentence. He too is now infected. The realization sets in. They bid Ken a sad farewell and cut the line. Sydney is devastated, reflecting on the work she and Ken had done together. Laurel Ann continues banging on the glass. Grant wonders aloud if the infected might be able to read lips. Dr. Mendez, deep in thought, concludes with growing horror that the virus has already reached them, because it's not in the air or blood, but in the words themselves. Certain English words have become carriers of the virus. When someone hears and understands these infected words, the virus embeds itself in their comprehension, spreading like a linguistic plague that can't be stopped. Mendez urges silence, but Grant argues that people must be warned if they're to survive. At that moment, Sydney receives a call from her children and learns they've also been infected. Laurel Ann suddenly vomits blood and collapses, likely because she couldn't find a new victim, suggesting the virus needs to exit once it has no target. Just then, a loud commotion outside reveals a horde of infected trying to breach the station. Grant theorizes the infected are drawn to voices, so Sydney records his voice and plays it through an external speaker. The mob hears the broadcast declaring Sydney Breyer is alive and follows the sound, lured away. Mendez switches to Armenian, and the group realizes that only English is carrying the infection. Grant and Sydney begin speaking in French, leaving the doctor in the booth as they head toward the kitchen. On the way, they're suddenly attacked by the infected Arab girl. They barely manage to defend themselves, ultimately killing her, leaving Sydney in shock. From the safety of the booth, they consider whether they would have to kill the doctor if he became infected. Before they can decide, Mendez bolts outside, trying to communicate something. Suddenly, loud music begins to play, drawing the infected back toward the building. Sydney, Grant, and the doctor lock themselves inside the control room. Trying to buy them time, the doctor climbs out the window and distracts the infected, giving Sydney and Grant a chance to escape. Now cut off from the world, they hide as Grant desperately works to understand how to reverse the infection. Meanwhile, Sydney begins writing the word kill obsessively on the walls and doors, revealing that she's now infected. Grant remembers what the doctor said. The danger lies in understanding. People get infected by repeating a word in an attempt to grasp its meaning. Realizing this, Grant tells Sydney that kill now means kiss, and begins repeating it gently. Slowly, her symptoms fade. Relieved and happy, they kiss. Then, in a last-ditch effort to fight the virus, they return to the broadcast and speak a string of confusing, self-contradictory phrases. Grant explains how the infection spreads through comprehension and urges listeners to stop trying to understand the words. The authorities try to shut the broadcast down, but Grant and Sydney press on, changing the meanings of common words. Outside, helicopters and gunfire grow louder. The military is slaughtering the infected. Grant yells for them to stop, and a sudden silence follows. He declares that tomorrow, life will go on, and that this isn't the end of the world, just the end of a day. As an amplified voice begins a countdown outside, Sydney joins Grant in the booth, and they kiss again. An explosion is heard, and the screen fades to black. During the credits, news reports reveal that quarantine failed. The virus eventually made it to the source of the English language, England. In a post-credit scene, we learn that Sydney and Grant have survived. They now speak fluent English again, but with a twist. They've developed a system of word games that help them stay safe. The film delivers horror not through blood and gore, but through sound and silence, making it eerily haunting.